During these festivals of theirs, the Jews were even capable of wild ecstasies of joy. What a sight they were, for instance, on the night of the ending of their most solemn sacred day, the Day of Atonement, when their high priest issued from the mysterious Holy of Holies, unharmed by his contact with supreme sanctity. The bitterness which they felt throughout the whole year against the high priest and his acolytes was forgotten and forgiven on that day. They arranged in his honor a procession worthy of a conquering general returning from his campaigns. They conducted the high priest to his home with music and singing. The Levites played on their harps and flutes. The flower of the priesthood danced before him. Then came a cortege of aristocratic priestly families, the venerable sages of the city, the scholars, the interpreters of the law, the people at large, the regular inhabitants of the city, mingling with the multitude of pilgrims. Dressed in their richest and most colorful clothes, carrying torches in their hands, singing and rejoicing, they conducted him home. They were a remarkable sight, again, on that festival which they called the Holy Day of Water Pouring. On that day they offered plain water as a sacrifice to their God. That was a festival for which I find the nearest parallel in our own Bacchus celebrations. To begin with, they illuminated Jerusalem in such a way that one would have believed the city to be in flames. They assembled on their roofs, they pulled the threads from their old clothes, dipped them in oil, and set them alight. The essential celebration occurred in the temple courts. There the great throng of pilgrims from the countryside was gathered, and the priests were ranged on the temple walls, the gates, and turrets. They too brought their worn-out robes of office, vestments which could not be assigned to any other purpose, soaked them in oil, and set them ablaze. Among those vestments so consigned to the flames, there might be some of the costliest hand-woven stuffs of gold and silver thread, of blue and purple wool, made specially on the looms dedicated to that labor within the temple, or brought as pious gifts by wealthy women of town and country. We gazed down from the Antonia Tower on the flood of flame which rose from the temple walls and was reflected from the roofs of the city. One might have thought the city was being sacked, but the crackle of the flames was drowned in the singing, in the joyous shouting which accompanied the wild dancing of the frenzied crowds in the temple area and in the narrow streets. What a sight, too, were the young priests, or, as they were called, the flowers or blossoms of the priesthood. Their white robes and white hats shone out of a sea of flame. Their naked feet moved in a rhythmic dance to the accompaniment of harp, flute, trumpet, and cymbal played by the Levites on the marble stairs. All bonds seemed to be loosed that night. The people felt that on this night of fire and water, even their God Jehovah had burst the confines of his eternal loneliness to mingle with his jubilant worshippers. They were drunk with his invisible spirit. Every moment he might lift them up in a flaming cloud and carry them off to the secret fastnesses of his heavens. Such was the rejoicing that even grave, solemn, and meditative sages and interpreters of the law were pulled into it, or actually became centers of radiating and delirious gaiety. The old were transformed into children. We saw bearded and reverend scholars juggling with flames like prestigitators with spheres. Young men danced between swords and young girls among flames. Some of them did magic tricks, for all of them were magicians after a fashion. What more need I say? On that day, or rather that night, for the chief celebrations began with nightfall, the grim city of Jerusalem and its somber and solemn temple were transformed into one gigantic altar on which the opposing elements of fire and water were offered in a single sacrificial gesture to their God. Astonishingly enough, their spiritual leaders were not their high priests, but their interpreters of the law, or, as they called them, their rabbis. Their influence over the masses was enormous, and the people followed them blindly. On the surface, it would appear that they had nothing against us, that is, against the power of Rome, so long as we did not interfere in their internal life. Inasmuch as their internal life consisted of their religious service and their study of sacred lore, we had neither reason nor inclination to interfere, but we could never tell what their intentions were and what they were plotting. looking at them in their shops or booths between the columns in the temple courts, looking at their rabbis with the long ritual fringes hanging from their clothes, with the leather straps bound on arm and forehead, observing them as they argued fiercely about some point of law, I could not help feeling that they were not the innocent lambs they pretended to be. The one good feature of the situation was this: however deep their hatred for us, the alien power, still deeper was their hatred and contempt for the power of their own. They had rather, 1,000 times over, submit to the rule of Rome than to that of the house of Herod, which they despised. But what love, what reverence, what inmost devotion they accorded their rabbis, their yea and naysayers. Their rabbis always moved amid throngs of pupils, like kings amid their bodyguards. The pupils kept their eyes fixed on the lips of their rabbi, so as not to lose a single word of interpretation and exegesis. Often these rabbis were sprung from the lowest ranks of the people. I saw among them such as lived in the most miserable section of the city, in huts consisting of plaited twigs. Round one of these huts, scores and hundreds of pupils would gather, waiting for the rabbi to finish his work and issue forth to interpret and teach the law. Others, again, were day laborers and field workers, paupers who had not so much as a decent garb to throw about themselves, and they would have gone naked if not for the generosity of their pupils. Some of these rabbis were lean with starvation. One that I saw was so withered that one could follow the descent of each bite of food down his throat. I was told that because of some vision of calamity he had taken the vow of fasting on himself, but others abstained from food simply because they had nothing to eat. They took no payment for their teaching, no matter how rich their pupils. More than once I saw, amid the throng which followed such a pauper or day laborer, and he might not be venerable with age, riders in fine linen on richly caparisoned asses. Sometimes the rabbi would be quite a young man, and old people would be following him and listening to his words with the utmost respect. I have never been able to understand wherein lay this profound power which they wielded over the people. For the people as a whole, and not only the following of pupils, was prepared to obey them in all things, no matter what dangers were entailed. We were, frankly, afraid of the power of the learned, and we kept close watch on them. It did not take me long to discover that our most natural allies in this atmosphere of hostility were the members of the higher aristocracy, with the high priests at their head. They belonged, moreover, to a party which psychologically approached our manner of thought. I shall not enter here into a detailed discussion of the differences between their parties. The subject may not be without importance, but the pursuit of it is invariably accompanied by a headache. I do not know whether this party was really as fond of Rome as it pretended to be, but I do know that the situation of the aristocratic families was such that they fell naturally into our hands. Without our help, they could not have remained where they were for a single day, and their need of us was greater than ours of them. By no stretch of the imagination could it be said that they were beloved of the people, all these high priests and their retinue of servants, Levites, singers, and sycophants. They were no light burden of rulership, and they took themselves with immense seriousness. I shall tell you more of this later, but here let me say that you Jews have nothing to be proud of in your kings and high priests and other state-mongers. It was with our strength that they were able to apply the whip to the people. However, I shall return to this subject. The people hated the high priests, but could do nothing against them. The priests guarded the temple, and the temple was the center of the religious life of the Jews. Their religion, in turn, was the central nerve and organ of their spiritual and physical existence. They lived in and for their religion. I have seen a world of men and lands. I was with Germanicus in Germany for 4 years. I learned the manners and customs of the barbarians beyond the Rhine. I have been in Gaul and Spain and Africa. I have delved into the mysteries of the Egyptian priesthood, of the magicians of Chaldea, and of the snake charmers of Abyssinia, but I had never yet encountered a people which did not dedicate its energies to fighting hostile neighbors, to acquiring the means for luxurious living, to displaying prowess and wisdom, to accumulating wealth, to indulging, in whatever manner it might be, the natural human passions. But in the case of the Jews, their interests, their whole life, their thoughts, their love, their prowess, and everything else were dedicated to a single passion, their God. On him they concentrated their being, and on how to carry out his commandments down to the minutest and strangest ritualistic details. And since the temple was the center of their religious life, it naturally became the center of all their activities, their meditations, dreams, and wishes. There was no other life for them. Thus, the high priest became not only the director of religious functions, but the ruler in effect of the whole people. He was the highest religious functionary, and, at the same time, the uncrowned king. He could send out his messengers to arrest Jews, even beyond the frontiers of Judea. And the priesthood was like a leech, sucking the blood and marrow out of the people. The high priests were bloated with wealth, for apart from the tithes and the first fruits, payable in kind, they imposed additional taxes on the people. With every sacrifice brought to the temple, there was a fee to be paid for the priestly stamp. When the poorest of the poor came bearing their doves, or a twig of incense, or a jar of wine, or a cruse of oil, or a measure of flour, there was something to be paid to the priests. And then the meat of the sacrifices. What their God received was a little blood, part of the fat, and a fragment of meat. The remainder went to the high priests. All these tithes went into the hands of a few families who divided among themselves the highest temple offices. The lower ranks of the priesthood, members of obscure families, lived in poverty. Theirs was the work. One might compare them to a slave class. There were also, among the lower levels of the priesthood, rebels and troublemakers who had a hand in every uprising.